was 16, I won a great victory. I felt in that moment I would live to be 100. Now I know I shall not see that.
I am Jerusalem.
In the tumultuous landscape of medieval Jerusalem, few figures stand as paradoxically powerful and vulnerable as Baldwin IV. Crowned king at just 13 years old,
behold your rightful king and heir to the throne of the kingdom of Jerusalem.
while battling the ravages of leprosy,
News that I am a leper.
his story transcends mere historical footnote. Baldwin ruled when the Crusader kingdom teetered on the edge of destruction, facing the brilliant Muslim leader Saladin and internal court conspiracies, all while his body betrayed him piece by piece. Yet instead of collapsing under these impossible burdens, Baldwin IV emerged as one of history's most remarkable leaders. How did a dying teenager hold together a fragile kingdom? What inner strength propelled him to military victories that stunned the medieval world? This is the extraordinary tale of courage, suffering, and unexpected triumph that forever changed the fate of Jerusalem.
Withdrawal, we will all die here. Do we have terms?
We have terms.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
The fateful moment that would alter Jerusalem's history began innocently enough. 9-year-old Baldwin, son of King Amalric I, was playing with friends in the palace gardens of Jerusalem in 1170. The royal tutor William of Tyre watched with growing concern as the young prince showed no reaction and his playmates accidentally hurt him. This wasn't normal boyhood toughness. Something was terribly wrong. The first signs of the disease manifested, William later wrote, when Baldwin was playing with other noble children. They began pinching one another on their arms and hands as children do, yet Baldwin alone felt no pain, though they pinched him until they nearly broke the skin. William, an educated man familiar with medical texts, conducted a simple test. He pricked the prince's arm with a needle. Baldwin felt nothing. Additional symptoms soon confirmed William's worst fears. The heir to Jerusalem had contracted leprosy, a disease seen as both a medical affliction and divine judgment in medieval times. King Amalric was devastated. The succession plan for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a precarious Christian outpost surrounded by Muslim territories, now faced catastrophe. The king intensified Baldwin's education in military and political affairs, knowing his son's reign would face extraordinary challenges. Baldwin proved an exceptional student despite his diagnosis, mastering languages, history, and the art of war with remarkable speed. What's extraordinary is how the young Baldwin processed this life-altering news. Rather than surrendering to despair, historical accounts suggest he threw himself into preparation for kingship with double determination. He seemed to understand that his time would be limited and that history would judge him harshly if his physical limitations undermined the kingdom's security. Ascending the throne, a teenage king faces impossible odds. When King Amalric died unexpectedly in 1174, 13-year-old Baldwin found himself thrust into power far sooner than anyone had anticipated. As the royal funeral procession wound through Jerusalem's narrow streets, whispers already spread about the kingdom's uncertain future under a leper king. Baldwin IV was crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom, in a ceremony both magnificent and tense. Observers noted the young king's composure, seemingly unshaken by either his immense responsibilities or the visible progression of his disease. The political landscape Baldwin inherited was treacherous. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile collection of coastal territories, fortified cities, and inland castles, had expanded under his father but remained vulnerable. To the south and east, Saladin was consolidating power, uniting Egypt and Syria under his banner with the clear intent of eventually reclaiming Jerusalem for Islam. Within the court, powerful noble families jockeyed for position, seeing the young king's illness as an opportunity to advance their interests. Raymond III of Tripoli, Baldwin's cousin, was appointed regent until the king reached majority at age 15. Raymond was competent but ambitious, and the relationship between regent and king grew increasingly strained. Baldwin demonstrated remarkable political acumen for his age, carefully building alliances with key nobles and the military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers. Many whispered that a leper could not rule, wrote a chronicler of the time, yet in council meetings it was often the young king who spoke with the greatest wisdom, silencing men 3 times his age. Baldwin faced skepticism not just from his nobles but from European powers whose support was crucial. The Byzantine Empire and the Italian maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa all questioned whether their interests would be secure under a sickly boy king. Foreign dignitaries who visited Jerusalem's court often came expecting to find a kingdom in disarray, only to be surprised by Baldwin's sharp intelligence and dignity. Perhaps most remarkably, Baldwin had to overcome the deep-seated medieval fear and stigma surrounding leprosy. Throughout Europe and the Near East, lepers were typically outcast from society, forced to announce their presence with bells or clappers, and forbidden from public gatherings. That a leper now sat on Jerusalem's throne, touching the royal scepter, dining with nobles and making laws, challenged fundamental social taboos. Some saw this as a divine test for the kingdom, while others whispered it was punishment for the Crusaders' sins, the military genius behind the mask. Few expected military brilliance from a teenage king battling a debilitating disease, yet it was on the battlefield where Baldwin IV most defied expectations. Despite his physical limitations, he developed into one of the most tactically gifted leaders of the Crusader states, repeatedly outmaneuvering Saladin, a commander widely regarded as one of history's greatest military minds. Baldwin's approach to warfare necessarily differed from his predecessors. Unable to rely on physical strength as his disease progressed, he compensated with meticulous planning, innovative tactics, and an uncanny ability to read the terrain and anticipate enemy movements. Contemporary accounts describe how he would study detailed maps of his kingdom for hours, memorizing every pass, water source, and defensive position. "The king may be afflicted in body," wrote a Templar knight after one campaign, "but God has blessed him with the sharpest military mind in Outremer." Baldwin understood the precarious position of the Crusader states better than most. Outnumbered and surrounded, the Kingdom of Jerusalem couldn't afford to lose significant battles or deplete its limited manpower. While other Crusader kings had often pursued aggressive expansion, Baldwin focused on a more sustainable defensive strategy, concentrating on holding key fortresses and securing vital supply routes. His military education had been intensive. From childhood, he'd been schooled in the specialized warfare of the Levant by veteran knights who understood that desert campaigns differed drastically from European combat. Baldwin mastered the crucial balance between heavily armored Frankish knights, devastating in charges but vulnerable to heat and thirst, and more mobile infantry and Turcopole-like cavalry. Baldwin's illness presented unique challenges on campaign. As leprosy attacked his extremities, he eventually lost the ability to grip a sword or hold reins effectively. Ingeniously, his armorers designed special stirrups and saddle modifications that allowed him to remain secure on horseback even when he couldn't feel his feet or hands. For battle, they crafted a specialized harness that would strap his sword arm in place, enabling him to at least appear combat-ready, a crucial morale factor for his troops. What made Baldwin truly exceptional was his adaptability when facing Saladin. The Ayyubid Sultan typically relied on superior numbers, mobility, and the desert heat to wear down Crusader forces before striking decisively. Baldwin countered by developing an intelligence network of native Christians, Bedouins, and merchants who provided early warnings of Saladin's movements. This information allowed him to avoid unfavorable engagements and choose battlegrounds that neutralized Saladin's advantages. Perhaps most impressively, Baldwin turned his disease into a psychological weapon. Saladin's forces were often unnerved by by reports of the untouchable king who felt no pain and fought despite terrible affliction. Some Muslim chroniclers suggested Baldwin possessed supernatural resilience, creating a mystique that occasionally gave his outnumbered forces a psychological edge. The Battle of Montgisert, Baldwin's greatest triumph. November 25, 1177, would forever mark Baldwin IV's defining moment as a military leader and the apex of his short reign. At just 16 years old, the Leper King achieved what seasoned commanders considered impossible, a decisive victory against Saladin's vastly superior forces at Montgisard. The circumstances leading to this confrontation were dire. Saladin had invaded the kingdom with an army of 26,000 men, one of the largest forces he had ever assembled. Baldwin, caught off guard with most of his nobles away, could muster barely 500 knights and a few thousand infantry. Jerusalem itself lay virtually undefended as Saladin's forces poured across the border, burning villages and capturing settlements with minimal resistance. Conventional wisdom dictated retreat to fortified positions. Instead, Baldwin made the audacious decision to intercept Saladin's army directly. As one chronicler wrote, the king, though suffering terribly from his affliction, declared he would rather die in battle than see the holy city fall while he lived. Baldwin rode from Jerusalem with the true cross carried before him, a relic believed to contain fragments of Christ's crucifixion cross. This powerful symbol rallied additional knights and sergeants to his banner along the route. Still severely outnumbered, Baldwin formulated a daring plan that relied on complete surprise. Saladin, confident in his overwhelming numerical advantage, had split his forces, sending raiding parties to pillage the countryside. His main army, laden with captured prisoners and plunder, moved sluggishly near the coastal plain of Montgisard. Intelligence from Baldwin's scouts suggested the Muslim forces had grown complacent, believing the Crusaders were cowering behind Jerusalem's walls. On the rain-soaked morning of the battle, Baldwin positioned his small force behind a series of low hills. As Saladin's army approached, the king orchestrated one of the most perfectly executed ambushes of the Crusader era. The Christian forces emerged suddenly from concealment, with Baldwin himself reportedly in the vanguard despite his illness, the royal banner and true cross prominent above the charging knights. The shock was complete. As one Muslim chronicler recounted, the Franks fell upon the Muslims like a predetermined fate. The heavy Frankish cavalry smashed into Saladin's unprepared columns, shattering their formation before they could organize an effective defense. The marshland terrain carefully chosen by Baldwin prevented the Muslim light cavalry from executing their usual encircling maneuvers. What followed was a rout of historic proportions. Saladin's elite Mamluk bodyguard fought desperately to shield their sultan, who narrowly escaped capture. By day's end, an estimated 90% of Saladin's army had been killed, captured, or scattered across the countryside. Baldwin had achieved what military historians would later call one of the most lopsided victories in medieval warfare. The psychological impact was even greater than the military one. Saladin, previously undefeated, had been humiliated by a teenage leper king. Throughout the Muslim world, the defeat was interpreted as divine judgment, temporarily halting Saladin's momentum and forcing him to rebuild his forces and reputation. The brutal reality of leprosy in medieval times behind Baldwin's public triumphs lay a private agony few historical figures have endured. His leprosy, today known as Hansen's disease, was particularly aggressive, and the medical understanding of the 12th century offered him little beyond suffering and stigma. Medieval physicians recognized several forms of leprosy, with Baldwin suffering from what they called leprosy of the joints, or lepra mutilans, the most severe form that progressively destroyed tissue, particularly in the extremities. Without understanding bacterial causes, doctors of the era attributed the disease to various imbalances in the four humours thought to regulate health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The disease corrupts not just the outward appearance, wrote one contemporary physician, but rots the very frame of the body from within, turning a man into something less than human before death finally grants mercy. Treatment options available to Baldwin were primitive and often excruciating. His court physicians likely subjected him to bloodletting to balance the humors. They applied caustic herbal poultices containing arsenic or mercury compounds that burned the skin but were believed to draw out corrupt humors. Historical records suggest Baldwin also underwent cauterization, where red-hot irons were applied to lesions, an agonizing procedure made more horrific by the knowledge that his disease had already destroyed the sensation in many affected areas. The progression of Baldwin's symptoms followed the typical, cruel pattern. The disease first attacked the peripheral nervous system, causing the loss of sensation that led to his childhood diagnosis. Skin became discolored with characteristic raised nodules and thickened patches. As the disease advanced, it moved to the destruction phase. Fingers and toes began to contract and deform. Tissue death set in, eventually leading to the loss of digits and, in Baldwin's final years, entire limbs. Facial disfigurement represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect. Historical accounts describe how Baldwin's features gradually became distorted as the disease progressed. His eyelids lost elasticity, preventing him from closing them properly and leading to corneal damage and eventual blindness. The collapse of nasal cartilage created the characteristic lion face appearance of advanced leprosy. Beyond the physical deterioration, Baldwin faced the profound social implications of his condition. Leprosy carried powerful religious associations in medieval society. Many interpreted it as divine punishment for sin, citing biblical passages where leprosy represented spiritual corruption. Others viewed lepers as living embodiments of purgatory, suffering on earth to cleanse their souls. A few enlightened voices, including some church authorities, suggested lepers bore a special resemblance to the suffering Christ and deserved compassion rather than revulsion. Yet for most, the instinctive reaction to leprosy was horror and fear. Ordinary lepers were banished from communities, forced to wear distinctive clothing, and prohibited from touching healthy individuals or sharing water sources. That Baldwin continued to rule, issue decrees, and lead armies while his disease progressed represented an extraordinary exception to medieval norms, a testament to both his remarkable will and the kingdom's desperate circumstances. Governing through pain, the political challenges ruling a medieval kingdom demanded extraordinary skill under the best circumstances. Governing Jerusalem as leprosy steadily destroyed one's body required political genius. Baldwin IV navigated a treacherous political landscape where his health was weaponized by ambitious nobles and external enemies alike. The Kingdom of Jerusalem operated under a complex feudal system where the monarch's power depended heavily on balancing competing noble factions. Baldwin inherited a particularly fractious court divided between native barons, those born in Outremer, and immigrant nobles recently arrived from Europe. These groups held fundamentally different views on how to manage relations with neighboring Muslim states, the natives generally favoring pragmatic coexistence, while newcomers pushed for aggressive expansion. The king's wisdom lies in making adversaries check each other, wrote one court chronicler, for when the great lords stand against one another, none can rise too high against the crown. Baldwin developed sophisticated strategies to maintain control despite his increasingly apparent physical limitations. He created a careful system of shifted responsibilities, delegating specific tasks to trusted officials while reserving final decision-making authority. As his condition worsened, he increasingly relied on a small inner circle who could interpret his wishes when communication became difficult. The young king proved remarkably adept at using symbolic displays of power when physical strength failed. When rumors spread about his deteriorating condition, Baldwin would suddenly appear at public ceremonies demonstrating his continued authority. He insisted on being physically present at court judgments and council meetings even when in extreme discomfort, understanding that his absence would create dangerous power vacuums. Perhaps most challenging was managing foreign perceptions of Jerusalem's stability. Baldwin maintained an extensive diplomatic correspondence with European monarchs and the Byzantine emperor, carefully crafting the narrative of his reign. These letters, some surviving today, reveal his strategic downplaying of his illness when seeking military aid, while simultaneously using his condition to evoke sympathy and support from religious authorities. The politics of succession loomed increasingly large as Baldwin's condition worsened. With no possibility of producing an heir himself, he needed to establish a clear succession path to prevent civil war after his death. This required delicate negotiations with his sister Sibylla, who carried the bloodline, and the powerful nobles who sought influence through her marriage. Baldwin's efforts to maintain control over this process represented some of his most sophisticated political maneuvering. Court intrigue took a particularly vicious turn as Baldwin's illness progressed. Several nobles began positioning themselves for the post-Baldwin era, forming factions and even conducting separate foreign policies. The king responded with strategic appointments and occasional shows of force, including the dramatic arrest of his own brother-in-law on treason charges. What made Baldwin's political acumen truly remarkable was his ability to leverage his very weakness as strength. When certain nobles hesitated to follow a leper king, Baldwin skillfully invoked religious sentiment, implicitly comparing his suffering to Christ's sacrifice. As one contemporary observed, those who would speak against him must also speak against the mysterious ways of God who placed him upon the throne. The silver mask, image and reality. Among the most enduring images associated with Baldwin IV is the silver mask he supposedly wore to conceal his disfigurement. This iconic symbol has appeared in modern films, novels, and artwork, yet its historical reality remains complicated, revealing much about both medieval attitudes toward disfigurement and our modern need for compelling historical narratives. Contemporary chronicles offer conflicting accounts about Baldwin's use of facial coverings. William of Tyre, the primary chronicler of Baldwin's early reign and the king's former tutor, makes no explicit mention of a mask. However, several later accounts reference the king concealing his features during public appearances as his disease progressed. As the affliction claimed more of his face, one account notes, the king took to covering himself before the public that they might be spared distress and that the dignity of the crown be preserved. The historical evidence suggests a more nuanced reality than the permanent silver mask of popular imagination. Baldwin likely employed various facial coverings as practical solutions for specific situations. During court ceremonies, he might have worn thin veils attached to his crown, similar to those used by Byzantine emperors on certain occasions. For military campaigns, he probably utilized elements of traditional Crusader headgear, the mail coif and fabric face coverings that protected against sun and sand, which conveniently provided additional concealment. If Baldwin did commission a more formal mask, historians suggest it would likely have been made of cloth, possibly silk rather than metal. A heavy silver mask would have been impractical in Jerusalem's heat and would have further complicated his breathing as the disease affected his nasal passages. Only for the most significant ceremonial occasions might a more elaborate mask with precious metal elements have been employed. The symbolic importance of facial covering in Baldwin's era extended beyond mere concealment. In medieval thought, the face represented one's inner nature and soul. Facial disfigurement carried profound implications. It wasn't merely aesthetic, but was interpreted as external manifestation of internal corruption. By covering his features, Baldwin wasn't simply hiding medical symptoms, but was engaging in a sophisticated form of royal image management. The king's countenance is the kingdom's face to the world, wrote one medieval political theorist. This concept held particular significance in Jerusalem, where the monarch represented Christendom in the Holy Land. Baldwin's covered face became paradoxically both an acknowledgement of his affliction and a refusal to let it define his kingship. The cultural memory of Baldwin's masked appearance gained particular power in later centuries. Medieval and Renaissance artwork often depicted him with increasingly elaborate facial coverings, reflecting evolving artistic conventions rather than historical accuracy. By the 19th century, Romantic painters had transformed his mask into a dramatic silver visage, embodying the tragic hero archetype popular in that era. Whether historically accurate or not, the silver mask has become a powerful metaphor for Baldwin's reign. a brilliant surface concealing suffering beneath a barrier between the private agony and public responsibility of kingship. Like many enduring historical symbols, its emotional truth transcends its literal reality. The image of the masked king continues to resonate because it captures something essential about Baldwin's story: his refusal to let personal affliction interfere with royal duty, and his determination to present strength to the world despite inner pain. Family betrayals and political marriages. While Baldwin fought external enemies and his progressing disease, perhaps his most painful battles occurred within his own family circle. The king's efforts to secure Jerusalem's future were repeatedly undermined by his closest relatives, particularly his sister Sibylla, whose marital choices would ultimately prove disastrous for the kingdom. As Baldwin's leprosy advanced, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. Without children of his own, the king focused on his sister Sibylla as the bloodline through which the throne would pass. Her marriage therefore became a matter of critical state importance. The future king of Jerusalem would be her husband or son. Baldwin initially arranged a politically advantageous match with William of Montferrat, an Italian nobleman with connections to both the Byzantine Empire and European royal houses. "In my sister's marriage lies the kingdom's fate," Baldwin reportedly told his advisors, "for I must ensure Jerusalem passes to worthy hands when God calls me to his side." When William died unexpectedly in 1177, leaving Sibylla pregnant with the future Baldwin V, the succession plan was thrown into disarray. What followed was one of the most consequential family betrayals in Crusader history. While Baldwin was incapacitated during a severe episode of his illness, Sibylla was secretly married to Guy of Lusignan, a handsome but militarily incompetent French nobleman newly arrived in the Holy Land. Contemporary chronicles suggest this marriage was orchestrated by Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, who had returned to court after years of exile and sought to build her power base through Sibylla's marriage. The king, upon recovering, was furious at this undermining of his royal authority and strategic planning. The marriage to Guy represented everything Baldwin had sought to avoid: an inexperienced newcomer with no understanding of the delicate power balance required to govern Jerusalem. Despite his anger, Baldwin found himself unable to annul the marriage without creating dangerous divisions within the royal family and the nobility. Instead, he attempted to mitigate the damage by limiting Guy's authority and grooming Sibylla's son, his nephew, as his direct heir. This created tense family dynamics at court, with Sibylla increasingly resentful of her brother's attempts to sideline her husband. As Baldwin's health deteriorated, Guy became more openly ambitious, forming alliances with recently arrived European nobles and positioning himself as the king's inevitable successor. Contemporary accounts describe uncomfortable court scenes where Guy would barely disguise his impatience for Baldwin's death, treating the king with the minimum required respect while actively undermining his policies. The king bears two crosses, one court observer wrote, that of his affliction, which he carries with saintly patience, and that of his sister's husband, which tests his forbearance daily. The family tensions reached their peak when Guy, as Baldwin's representative, failed to support a crucial military campaign against Saladin. This military abandonment, viewed as near treasonous, pushed Baldwin to unprecedented action. In a dramatic court ceremony, Baldwin formally disinherited Guy, stripped him of the Count of Jaffa and Ascalon title, and crowned his 5-year-old nephew as co-king Baldwin V. This extraordinary family rupture created lasting factions among Jerusalem's nobility that would persist beyond Baldwin IV's lifetime. Some supported the king's decision, seeing Guy as dangerous and incompetent. Others rallied around Sibylla and Guy, believing Baldwin's illness had clouded his judgment. The court effectively split into rival camps, weakening the kingdom precisely when unity was most needed against Saladin's growing power. The failed peace with Saladin. Among the most intriguing aspects of Baldwin's reign was his complex relationship with his greatest adversary, Saladin. Despite being mortal enemies on the battlefield, a remarkable mutual respect developed between the Leper king and the Muslim sultan, leading to several attempts at establishing lasting peace, efforts that ultimately failed due to forces beyond either leader's control. After Baldwin's stunning victory at Montgisard in 1177, the power dynamic between Jerusalem and Saladin's territories fundamentally changed. Rather than pursuing total military advantage, Baldwin demonstrated political sophistication by opening diplomatic channels. Contemporary sources suggest he recognized that Jerusalem's long-term survival required some form of coexistence with its Muslim neighbors. Two men of wisdom, wrote one Arab chronicler, may find common ground even when their faiths cannot be reconciled. Saladin, for his part, developed a grudging admiration for the young king who had defeated him against overwhelming odds. Muslim accounts describe Saladin's astonishment at learning more details about Baldwin's physical condition, leading him to comment to his advisors, "How is it that this man, afflicted as he is, fears not death or disease when commanding his armies, while healthy kings hide in their palaces?" The first serious peace negotiations occurred in 1180 when Baldwin sent a delegation to Cairo. The proposed terms reflected practical realities rather than religious ideology. Jerusalem sought secure pilgrim routes and trading rights, while Saladin wanted military access through Crusader territories for campaigns against his Muslim rivals in northern Syria. Initial discussions proved promising, with both sides making significant concessions. These peace efforts faced fierce opposition from hardliners on both sides. Within Baldwin's court, newly arrived European nobles and the military orders, particularly the Templars, condemned any accommodation with Muslim powers as betrayal of Crusader ideals. They undermined negotiations by conducting unauthorized raids into Muslim territory and spreading rumors that Baldwin's illness had weakened his resolve to defend Christianity. Similarly, Saladin faced pressure from religious authorities who viewed any permanent peace with Frankish infidels as contrary to jihad obligations. Though Saladin held greater authority over his subjects than Baldwin did over the independent-minded Crusader barons, he too needed to maintain religious legitimacy for his rule. Personal communication between the two leaders offers fascinating glimpses into their relationship. When Baldwin suffered a severe health crisis in 1181, Saladin reportedly sent his personal physicians, bearing medicinal herbs not available in Crusader territories, along with a message expressing hope for his adversary's recovery.
I will send you my physicians.
Assalamu alaikum.
Baldwin, despite advisors urging him to reject anything from Muslim hands, accepted this humanitarian gesture and sent exotic European falcons as gifts in return. The most significant attempt at lasting peace came in 1183, when both leaders recognized the exhaustion their ongoing conflict inflicted on their populations. A truce was negotiated that would have established stable borders, shared water sources, and religious access to holy sites. Contemporary accounts suggest both Baldwin and Saladin genuinely sought this agreement as their personal legacies, Baldwin knowing his life was nearing its end, and Saladin perhaps recognizing in his opponent's courage something that transcended religious divisions. They might have achieved in wisdom what armies could not settle by the sword, wrote one chronicler, had they alone decided the matter. The peace ultimately collapsed due to an incident that highlighted the fragility of cross-religious diplomacy in the era. A Crusader noble, defying royal authority, attacked a Muslim caravan traveling under promised safe passage. When Baldwin, by then severely incapacitated, proved unable to punish the offenders effectively, Saladin concluded that the king no longer commanded sufficient authority to enforce any treaty. The final battle at Kerak in November 1183, Baldwin IV undertook what would become his final military campaign, a desperate relief expedition to the fortress of Kerak that demonstrated both his extraordinary courage and the tragic limitations imposed by his advancing disease. This last battle encapsulated everything remarkable about the Leper King's reign: tactical brilliance, physical suffering, and unflinching determination. Kerak Castle, a massive Crusader fortress east of the Dead Sea, controlled crucial trade routes and served as a strategic buffer protecting Jerusalem's eastern approaches. Its lord, Reynold of Chatillon, had provoked Saladin's wrath by repeatedly breaking truces and attacking Muslim caravans. When Saladin laid siege to Kerak with a massive army, it represented both military necessity and personal vengeance. What made this siege particularly dramatic was its timing, coinciding with wedding celebrations for Reynold's stepson. Inside the fortress, a royal wedding proceeded while Saladin's mangonels hammered the walls. According to contemporary accounts, Saladin chivalrously ordered his engineers to avoid bombarding the tower where the wedding feast occurred, even while continuing attacks on the rest of the fortress. When news of the siege reached Jerusalem, Baldwin faced a momentous decision. His condition had deteriorated significantly since his earlier campaigns. Now virtually blind, unable to use his hands, and suffering from recurring fevers, most expected him to delegate the relief mission to his nobles. Indeed, most of his advisors urged precisely this course of action. None would have thought less of the king had he remained in Jerusalem, wrote one chronicler, for his body was but a ruin of what it once had been. Baldwin, however, refused to entrust the kingdom's defense to others, particularly as one potential commander was Guy of Lusignan, whom the king no longer trusted after previous military failures. Despite his physician's warnings that the journey might kill him, Baldwin ordered preparations for a relief expedition under his personal command. The physical arrangements for this final campaign reveal the extraordinary accommodations necessary for Baldwin's condition. Unable to mount a horse unassisted, he was carried to his specially modified saddle. Contemporary accounts describe how his remaining fingers had to be carefully positioned around the reins, which were then secured to his hands with bandages. A framework supported his weakened upper body while loyal knights rode alongside to ensure he didn't fall. Baldwin's relief force departed Jerusalem in a solemn procession with the True Cross carried before the king, as was customary for major expeditions. Witnesses described the people of Jerusalem lining the streets in silent tribute, many weeping at the sight of their suffering king riding out to battle one final time. The march to Kerak became a painful ordeal for Baldwin. Each day's journey exacerbated his symptoms, with the king reportedly slipping in and out of consciousness during the most difficult terrain. Yet he refused all suggestions to turn back, understanding that his presence was crucial for morale and command unity. When Saladin received intelligence of Baldwin's approach, he faced a difficult decision. His siege operations had made progress but were not yet decisive. Engaging Baldwin's forces while maintaining the siege would divide his army. Most significantly, Saladin appeared reluctant to directly battle the king, whose courage he had come to respect. After brief deliberation, he ordered his forces to withdraw from Kerak rather than risk confrontation. Baldwin's relief column reached Kerak to find the siege lifted, a victory achieved without battle. The king had secured his objective through sheer determination and the power of his reputation. It represented a final triumph of will over physical limitation, a fitting capstone to his military career. The agonizing final years. The period following the Kerak campaign witnessed Baldwin IV's most intense suffering as leprosy accelerated its inexorable destruction of his body. These final years, from late 1183 to early 1185, represent one of history's most poignant examples of a ruler clinging to authority even as physical capability abandoned him completely. By this stage, Baldwin's condition had progressed to its most devastating phase. Blindness had become total, with corneal damage so severe that his eyes could no longer close properly. Contemporary accounts describe how attendants would periodically moisten his eyes with herbal solutions to prevent complete desiccation. His hands and feet had undergone severe mutilation, with several fingers and toes lost entirely to the disease's necrotic effects. The king's body betrayed him piece by piece, wrote one witness, yet his mind remained sharp as a Damascus blade, trapped within a crumbling fortress of flesh. The disease's progression affected virtually every system. Damage to facial nerves made speaking increasingly difficult, forcing Baldwin to develop alternative communication methods with his closest advisors. Respiratory complications caused chronic coughing and difficulty breathing, especially during Jerusalem's dusty summers. Perhaps most debilitating were the recurrent fevers that left him bedridden for days at a time, during which court business necessarily continued without his direct oversight. Baldwin's daily care became increasingly complex, requiring a dedicated team of attendants. Historical accounts mention special feeding implements designed for his use after he lost the ability to grasp conventional utensils. Bathing became a medical procedure rather than routine hygiene, with attendants carefully cleaning wounds and applying ointments to prevent infection. The king's bedchamber essentially transformed into a medieval intensive care unit. Despite these extraordinary challenges, Baldwin fought tenaciously to maintain personal control over governmental functions. Court records show his signature eventually replaced by a royal seal when he could no longer hold a writing implement on documents until very near his death. When unable to attend council meetings, he had detailed minutes delivered to his sick room and issued written instructions in response.